Good morning, and thanks, John. It's great to be here today and to have the invitation to present. My briefing today will touch on the origins of the IGR and what Treasury's role is in producing it. I'll step through how we do it and then explain the three scenarios that underpin the 2015 IGR and then touch on the main economic and fiscal results. So, the IGR is a requirement under the Charter of Budget Honesty Act. The Charter also deals with the substance and timing of other major fiscal statements, including the contents of the fiscal strategy that's contained in the budget and the timing and substance of the MyEFO and pre-election economic and fiscal outlooks. It's required to be produced, publicly released and tabled by the Treasurer every 5 years and to assess the long-term sustainability of current government policies looking ahead 40 years, and that's to include considering the implications of demographic change. I just wanted to point a few things out about all of that, the legislative basis of the IGR and what it's sort of set up to do. The first thing is to emphasise that it projects on the basis of current policy, and so that's policy is announced by the government of the day and not necessarily as implemented at the time. Secondly, it assumes no further policy change, and I'll come back to that and why that's important. And then thirdly, perhaps by default, but I think also by design, the way that the entire exercise is designed and constructed really lends itself to focusing on the major areas of spending where demographic drivers are the most important. And I take the points made just prior about the revenue side and basically, I think they're good points. But to frame all of this another way, it's really narrowing it down to what would be the impact on spending if current policies were maintained for the next 40 years. I think sometimes that gets a little lost. There's a lot of suggestions about what else the IGR should do, but if we bring it back to the core of what it was set up to do, that would be it. Treasury's role in producing the IGR involves doing the modelling that sits behind it and preparing draft and then a final report for the Treasurer. The final report is the Treasurer's document. That obviously involves a significant commitment of resources across Treasury and consultation across government. To actually do this, we actually had a steering committee set up around 2 years ago, chaired by Deputy Secretary Nigel Ray, and that sort of oversees the overall production of the IGR and tests its assumptions and the coherence of all of the elements, if you like. The coordination of the product is handled by a team in Budget Policy Division, where I work, and draws on expertise from right across the Treasury, macroeconomists, demographers, actuaries and communications specialists. We have modellers looking at tax, retirement incomes and particular sort of spending elements in the budget. And then, of course, various policy experts and not least those in our social policy area who have the expertise in health, pensions, disability and so on. How's it done? Well, the methodology of IGRs has remained quite stable over time. We're transparent about where the methodology has been updated, and you can look through successive IGRs to trace that. The key changes that occur really pertain to changes in policy in between IGRs, and then, of course, updating all of the central parameters to reflect experience and latest knowledge. You can think of it as an exercise of like putting together projections at a point in time based on what we currently know. And these have to be demographic and economic parameters appropriate for a 40-year projection horizon. And these are all then used as inputs for more detailed spending models and also a debt model. I don't need to explain to people here the distinction between projections and forecasts, but we're very much in the world of projections. We start this process really anchoring the long-term projections in the numbers that are prepared already for the budget or MyEFO. So the starting point for the 2015 IGR was in fact the 2014-15 MyEFO, which was released in December. And that serves as the baseline, if you like to think of it as both the fiscal starting point and in terms of the policies that were sort of announced at that time. So then to step through what the IGR does, we have a number of different models, and taking it from the top right of this slide, obviously a population model needs to combine the factors of fertility, mortality and net overseas migration. On NOM, the policy is actually set each year, and we take the numbers from the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook for the first few years, and then we have to devise what we think is a longer-term assumption about NOM based on current policy. And so you've seen in successive IGRs that number has tended to increase, and but we can't project what we might anticipate to be changes in policy looking ahead. The labour force models produce age and gender specific participation rates for different age cohorts. Our unemployment rate assumption is pretty much based in our medium-term economic modelling of taking it back to the Nehru over a period of time of around 5%. And we have to make some assumptions and projections on hours worked. The economic projections then extend what we already have in the MyEFO or budget context, which is a 10-year set of economic parameters. And we have to take out to 40 years our best assumptions on things like nominal and real growth, changes in prices across the economy and wages. The revenue side of the equation is actually modelled in the short term, and that's sort of consistent with our medium-term economic modelling. What we have in this IGR is a recovery in revenue over the next few years from around 22% of GDP to 23.9%. At that point, we hold that assumption constant on the basis that successive governments have generally decided to hand back bracket creep, and one way or another tend to make decisions that keep a lid on aggregate receipts. And of course, that is itself a policy question. And but for the modelling side of things, you have to make an assumption like that, or else you would find growth in revenue that isn't sort of grounded in current policy, and that perhaps becomes so large that it tends to look a little strange. So all of these parameters then feed through into the spending models across health, aged care, income support payments, education and training, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and the Commonwealth Defined Benefit Super Scheme. They're the main areas of spending that we're modelling closely. Combined, they feed into a fiscal aggregate projections model where we produce our estimates of the underlying cash balance, the fiscal balance and so on, and the borrowing requirement that comes with that. A recent innovation in our medium-term and long-term models is to incorporate a debt model where we can look at the impact on the Commonwealth Government securities market and calculate net worth and sort of the interest implications of debt. So just to explain the three scenarios that were part of this IGR, the legislative requirement is, if you think of it in terms of projecting on the basis of policy as announced, and so the proposed policy line is the usual way that we would run IGR projections, and that assumes implementation of announced policies. Now, obviously, in the context of this IGR, there were a range of measures that had not been implemented by the time of MyEFO last year, but which remained government policy. And so the second line that we have there, the currently legislated line, gives you a sense of the significance from a fiscal sustainability perspective of the range of measures that were outstanding. The previous policy line, you could think of that as a way of understanding the full impact of the 2014-15 budget, where most of these measures were announced. It gives you sort of another benchmark against which you can assess progress. One of the key economic messages of the 2015 IGR, as those before it, is that a strong economy is really essential as an ingredient in the fiscal sustainability equation. We project that real GDP per capita will be lower in the growth in real GDP per capita will be lower in the next 40 years than in the past 40 years. And that's largely as a result of some of the demographic tailwinds slowing and then no longer contributing to growth as they had in the past. What that means is that productivity really becomes the central driver of projected improvements in living standards. And as has been pointed out, the productivity number that's included in the IGR is very much an assumption based on historical experience, and the productivity assumption has actually come down over time through the IGRs and now sits at 1.5% growth per annum. The Treasurer has said that that's a big assumption or a big if, and certainly warrants a policy focus. But it's something that I'd leave to the Secretary. I expect he'll touch on that later in the program today. The other relevant point to make around this chart is not that these are preordained outcomes, it's more that policy is capable of shifting the dial across any of the three Ps. And to the extent that it can, that can make a significant difference over a 40-year horizon. And these are simply the projections that we've included and anticipating, I suppose, that where policy can make a difference, we can drive a better outcome. Now back to the key results of the 2015 IGR. I'll just focus on the underlying cash balance in the interest of time. So the measures contained in the 2014-15 budget were projected to see the budget return to surplus around the end of this decade, and then for there to be surpluses of around 1% of GDP over the projection period. And that's consistent with the government's fiscal strategy. The currently legislated line, which is perhaps, you think of that as closer to the current state of play, sees no surplus at any point over the next 40 years and a deficit at the end of the projection period of around 6%. The IGR sort of makes its own conclusions around the sustainability of these different scenarios, and the policy chapter in the IGR suggests that this indicates that more needs to be done to achieve fiscal sustainability, and whether it's the measures contained in last year's budget or other measures, other alternatives of a similar value, the government would be pursuing those. In terms of the individual spending pressures, the proposed policy scenario still sees significant increases in spending as a share of GDP across health, the NDIS and aged care. That'd be the major contributors to growth in spending. The currently legislated scenario shows that under current policy settings, the age and service pension is another area where there's a significant increase in spending as a share of GDP. We also produce numbers in the back of the report that show spending in real per capita terms, and there perhaps the story is not so scary. I thought I'd finish today by presenting some early work that we've begun to focus on that looks at the IGRs across time. I was asked to reflect on some of the strengths and weaknesses of IGRs, and being limited by time, I thought I'd just focus on health spending and the story that it tells across time. What we have here is a chart that shows the relevant projections across the four IGRs from 2002, 2007, 2010 and 2015 for the Commonwealth spending on health. And I think looking across the IGRs in this way, it's easy to see their contribution, not of each one in isolation, but really focusing more on what has changed between them and arguably as a result of them. So when the first IGR was published in 2002, together with the budget papers of that year, Commonwealth health spending accounted for around 4.75% of GDP and was projected to increase to nearly 10% of GDP over the 40-year projection period. Whereas the 2015 IGR shows the starting point for Commonwealth health spending is around 1.5 percentage points lower than anticipated under that 2002 set of projections. I think there's two sets of takeaway messages. First, there's been positive surprises in terms of the size of the economy, strong nominal GDP growth from the mining boom, a larger and younger population, higher than anticipated participation, and all of that amounts to a very important effect that operates in the background here. But the second set of things to note is the success of policy changes, in part spurred by IGRs and specific measures that have been taken in the budget context over the years have helped keep spending on a more sustainable trajectory or delay the onset of spending pressures. So this work, looking across the series of IGRs and the different areas, is something we plan to devote some more time to in the months ahead. But I just thank you for your kind attention today. Looking forward to the discussions that follow, and congratulations to CEPA and its leadership team for this initiative. Thank you.